It's lovely to see you all here. My name is Jonathan Hill, and I am the director of the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, which is hosting tonight's event. We are very fortunate to have Professor Hugh Roberts with us, who is over in the UK for a short period of time from Tufts University in the US. I started my PhD about 20 years ago. I finished it since then, happily. But when I started, there were very few people working on Algeria and the Maghreb, and Professor Roberts was one of them, so I'm very familiar with his work, his writings on the pouvoir in Algeria, the Amazigh, the Berbers, and all the most important cultural and political trends that took place in the country. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome him here tonight. The title of his talk, as you can see, is Revolutions and Forms of Politics in North Africa and the Middle East, Boussoufism and the Constitution of the Algerian State. Professor Roberts is currently based at Tufts, but has taught at a number of universities around the world, including in the UK, the universities of East Anglia, Sussex, and SOAS, just up the road. He has published very widely on not just Algeria, but also Egypt and the wider region, and has a book forthcoming on le gouvernement berbère, la cité kabyle dans l'Algérie précoloniale, which will be out hopefully sometime this year. So do please keep an eye out for that. Without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to be speaking about Algeria, my favorite subject, at King's College, and particularly a pleasure to be speaking at the Institute for Middle East Studies, especially in view of the fact that it has as its director someone who knows about the Maghreb, which isn't true of every Middle East center, it seems to me. But John, of course, has made major contributions to the study of Algeria, and I've just learned from him that he has a major contribution to the study of Tunisia taking shape, which is very good news indeed. And I can only wish that other centers of Middle East studies in the UK looked to Maghrebists to run them. I think that would lead to a very interesting, refreshing change. Anyway, that's just me expressing perhaps a vain hope. Boussoufism and the constitution of the Algerian state, forms of politics. Let me see if I can manipulate this correctly. One way of describing or labeling the efforts I've made over the years to illuminate Algerian politics is a kind of long-standing, long-running campaign to counter opacity. Those of you familiar with the literature, particularly perhaps the French literature and also the English language literature on Algeria, may be aware that the opacity of Algerian politics or of the Algerian state or the Algerian political system has often been a complaint of onlookers, as if much more often, it seems to me, than the complaint is made of any other country in the Middle East or North Africa. Algeria seems to provoke this dissatisfaction amongst onlookers to a much greater extent than any of her neighbors. And with this, of course, the complaint about opacity is in fact the premise of a demand for transparency. And that demand is, I think, quite naturally resisted by the Algerian authorities. What has struck me over the years, and perhaps I'm being a little unfair to someone whose work I've overlooked, is that the preoccupation with opacity hasn't led to any kind of analysis of the constituents of opacity, of its elements, of the reason for it. And I have been of the view for a long time that quite a lot of the problem of opacity resides in the eye of the beholder, not in the object that is being observed. And the argument I'm going to develop about something I call Boussoufism is part of, not by no means the whole part, but part of a long-term project of responding to the challenge of, if you like, unpacking opacity and countering it. As you can see here, I argue that there are two elements of the alleged opacity of the Algerian state that are inherent in the object. Le secret d'État, official secrets as they're known here. Every state has to have secrets. and no self-respecting state is going to undress and let everybody look at every aspect of it. The other element that I think may be considered to have aggravated, in a sense, the objective element of opacity is the tradition of the maquis, that is, the tradition of guerrilla warfare out of which the Algerian state was constituted. Guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, it's the irregular aspect of it that exasperates regular soldiers trying to put a stop to it. But a key element of guerrilla warfare is, of course, that the maquisards, the guerrillas, come out of the shadows. They come out of nowhere. It's hit-and-run warfare. It's the element of surprise is a permanent, necessary constituent of guerrilla strategy. And the way of the maquisard, or of the guerrilla, is undoubtedly, in my view, a source of, if you like, of practices, habits, conventions that reinforce the natural secrecy of the Algerian state. But there are three other sources that, in my view, are problems in the outlook of the onlookers. I've worked for a very long time on the first of these, the problems in the political anthropology of Algeria, arising out of the success of, ironically, a British anthropologist, Ernest Gellner, in persuading everybody that Berber politics are to be understood in terms of a theory known as the segmentarity theory, and that the really very interesting work of the French colonial ethnographers could be safely ignored or misinterpreted. The point about Gellner's theory was that Berber society, as he analyzed it, has no institutions. That's a fundamental premise of the radical Gellnerian version of this theory. Now, a society that has no political institutions is not going to have political traditions. If any of you are familiar with Gellner's work, you'll know that he basically says the social structure is the source of the problem of order in Berber society. He's talking, of course, about some sort of timeless, traditional Berber society. The social structure, which is a structure of segmentary relationships, where kinship is predominant, is the key factor, is the source of the problem of order and the source of the solution to the problem. There are no institutions. Now, the fact is that is not true. I don't presume to say it's not true of Morocco, where he studied, but in Algeria, Algerian society had institutions, and I don't mean simply the society closely controlled by the Ottoman Regency. I'm talking about pre-colonial Algeria, of course. But the Society of the Mountains had institutions, and those institutions have given rise to traditions that are still alive in Algeria. Above all, the tradition of the Jama', the tradition of the council or assembly in the village or sometimes at tribal level, which is a tradition, a very long-standing tradition of local grassroots democracy. It's not the same as modern conceptions of democracy, if we can remember what they were when we had it, but they are definitely important elements in the outlook of Algerians right up until now. So there's been a necessary correction, which I've done my best to undertake, of the problem in the academic tradition of political anthropology in Algeria. That leaves problems in the Pol-Sci analysis. A lot of work has been done, and a lot of that work has been very useful, but it's had limitations. The limitations of methodological individualism that, for example, in a pioneering work that I very much admire by the American political scientist William Quandt, Revolution and Political Leadership, that came out when 1969, I think it was, 1970. It's a study of the revolutionary elite. You will learn a lot from it if you haven't already read that material. But it's really analyzing the elite in terms of individuals and then asking the question, which category do these individuals belong in? Radicals, revolutionaries, military, intellectuals, etc., etc. It's useful, it yields information and insight, but it's really limited by the focus on individuals. So it needs to be complemented by a second approach somewhere. We have a lot of work that really displaces the study of politics to the study of bureaucracy, where sociological conceptions such as patron-client relations come in, and clientelism, or clientelisme as the French call it, becomes the key concept ordering the analysis. And of course that also yields insights. I'm not knocking it. I'm saying, however, it is a bit of a displacement from the traditional concerns of political analysis. We also have a displacement to what the French came to call le sérail, the seraglio, meaning the court, once Algerian politics began to resemble court politics in the 1980s under Chadli, with lots of sort of strange maneuverings in the corridors. Something which, the term le sérail wasn't used of Boumedienne's Algeria at all, but it began to be used in the 1980s. And there, the analysis tended to also, of course, focus on the army and was very much an analysis or an argument in terms of factions known as clans. And I've argued for quite a long time that the word clan is a misnomer. We're not talking about kinship units. We're talking about historically constituted factions. And that, of course, also yields an element of valid conclusions, valid information. But I regard it nonetheless as a displacement from the proper study of political science or political analysis, which should be the study of government. And that includes the study of the philosophy, presuppositions, you can read all this for yourself, of government in Algeria. And the question of how specifically Algeria is governed doesn't get raised, let alone answered. There's an all-purpose, off-the-peg answer. It's authoritarian, which tends to suggest it's just like so many other places. And yet people continually express surprise at things that happen in Algeria. Ex Africa aliquid novi, from out of Africa, always something new. Well, that's certainly true about Algeria. Algeria has been a country that has repeatedly surprised onlookers, surprised the French, surprised the Americans, surprised the Brits when the Brits take a look at Algeria, which isn't that often, unfortunately. And so I've taken the view that the issues that there at the bottom of the page have tended to be ignored, and that constitutes a problem. Then there is finally the problems in the history or the historiography of Algeria, and I'm just going to mention two. Those of you who have read a little about Algeria will be presumably aware of an important event in 1956 during the War of Liberation, the first Congress of the National Liberation Front, the Front de Libération Nationale, held in the Kabylia region, in the Soumam Valley in Kabylia. And this is known for short as the Soumam Congress. A great deal of the historical argument about Algeria regards this as an absolutely crucial event that then became in some sense betrayed. That the decisions, or some of the decisions at the Soumam Congress, and right up until today, you'll see Algerian authors at any rate, and some French language authors and some other authors, suggesting that the Soumam Congress gave the Algerian Revolution a strong democratic element that should have given rise to a far more attractive state than has actually come into existence, a more democratic state, that key decisions taken at that conference, at that Congress, in particular the decision to the proclamation of the primacy of the political over the military. That political matters, political things take primacy over military ones, that decision was subsequently reversed or abandoned, and that this was a kind of something of a calamity for the development of the revolution and the development of post-colonial, post-independence Algerian politics. Now, in my view, there's an element of truth in this, and there's a massive element of exaggeration. And in other words, there's a myth about the Soumam Congress, and it continues to influence not only onlookers and academics and journalists, but also large numbers of Algerians to this day, in my opinion. I realize that's a controversial opinion, but progress occurs through debate and controversy. And the other thing that I would just mention is that I think it's still very striking that there's still no serious complete history of the Boumedienne era. And yet many Algerians will, if asked, acknowledge, perhaps a little grudgingly, that Boumedienne was a crucially important figure in Algerian history. And I think that this is a remarkable lacuna in the historiography of Algeria. Okay, this is a bit of a long-winded introduction, but I think that as a result, there are grounds for dissatisfaction in the understanding of Algerian politics. The complaint about opacity is symptomatic of that, even if it hasn't in practice led anywhere useful. The interesting thing about the complaint about opacity is that it suggests or implies that something important is being withheld from view. And in my view, one might think that only trivial things are being withheld from view, the rather sordid cut and thrust of factional conflict. But in fact, it's my opinion, I will argue, a premise of my argument is something important has been not so much withheld from view as difficult to discern, difficult to see, more or less invisible for a very long time. And this is, in my view, something I call a form of politics, and which I call, as this particular form of politics, I call it Boussoufism. And it has very largely escaped, in fact, it has escaped the attention of virtually all the onlookers outside the cognoscenti in Algeria itself, who are well aware of Boussoufism, but keep their knowledge, their knowledge of this as, in a sense, the knowledge of a secret, esoteric knowledge of a secret circle. Now, I'll be elaborating the notion of a form of politics presently. I just want to make a couple of general observations about the peculiarity of the Algerian Revolution. The FLN, since independence, and that really means the party of the FLN, one should use the acronym PFLN. Its official title is Le Parti du FLN, Hizb. And it's neither ruled nor governed Algeria, nor been the source of power. So one of the mistakes that one often sees, perhaps more often in journalistic than in academic discussion these days, referring to the FLN as the ruling party, is actually wide of the mark. It's never had that function or that capacity. That's the first point. In other words, Algeria has not been a single-party state like Tunisia. Tunisia, the party was a serious ruling party, was the source of power. The military weren't. In Algeria, it's the other way around. In that sense, Algeria has been more like Egypt than Tunisia. The revolution has differed from most 20th century revolutions in this important respect. It's had no commanding figure. It's had no Lenin, if you like, no Mao, no Ho Chi Minh, no Nasser even, no Mustafa Kemal. It's had collegial leadership, and it has had no clear doctrine or theoretical doctrine. There hasn't been, even Egypt had Nasser's philosophy of the revolution. And this absence is one of the reasons why academics have fallen back on Fanon as a kind of faute de mieux. Fanon is very interesting. I'm not knocking Fanon for a moment. I have a lot of respect for Fanon. But he wrote for himself. He wrote about Algeria, but he was not an official voice of the revolution. He wasn't the theorist who pointed the way in the way that Lenin was for Russia, for the Bolsheviks, or Mao for the communists in China, and so on. So there's been this important absence. And this is connected to the fact that the FLN's principal leaders, whose names are known at any rate to those who read any book about the Algerian War, such as Alistair Horn's The Savage War of Peace, or any of the books since then, not one of them achieved a position of commanding, let alone uncontested overall authority. That's an important fact. We have collective leadership, which means there's, in a sense, constant ferment, constant power struggle, lots of arguments, no one really laying down the law, except perhaps for a short period, the figure of Aban Ramdan, but he came to grief. This is a contrast not only with the other countries I've mentioned, but it's actually a contrast with the nationalist movement in Algeria prior to 1954. We see the FLN, of course, came out of the Party of the Algerian People, the PPA, whose leader for 30 years, Messali Hadj, 28 years, attained precisely a position of commanding authority. So one can talk about Messalism in relation to the PPA. People don't talk about Abbasism in relation to the UDMA, but Farhat Abbas had a comparable position of commanding authority in his party. The point is that when the FLN sets it up and then obliges all the other formations in Algerian Muslim politics to rally to it, they have no options outside the FLN. You must rally to the FLN or you cease operations. We will not tolerate anybody operating outside the fold. What happens is the price to be paid is the imposition of a collective leadership and a degree of, if you like, in a way, a degree of muddle about the doctrinal outlook of this revolutionary movement. Okay, now I want to talk about an enigma arising out of this state of affairs. I'm fast-forwarding to 1962. There was, of course, agreement within the FLN on the immediate objective of ending the colonial order, in a sense, the negating colonialism, the negative purpose. There wasn't a consensus, nothing like the same profound agreement on what the future should look like, what the independent state should be composed of, consist of, how it should be constituted. These matters simply hadn't been thoroughly discussed, and it seems to me that the leaders of the FLN, for really very understandable reasons, said, well, we'll deal with that later. We've got a war to fight. Because to try to deal with it during the war would have been to precipitate divisions. They were quite right, in my view. But at the end of the war, in 1962, the FLN, in a sense, falls apart. The provisional government it had set up that had functioned pretty well, with fits and starts, with difficulties, with awkward moments, but had nonetheless performed its function, is stigmatized, blamed, and bypassed by other forces. The attempt to hold a meeting of notionally the supreme body of the FLN, the CNRA, the National Council of the Algerian Revolution. This meeting is held, but then breaks up in chaos, doesn't reach a conclusion. And then we have the General Staff of the Army in revolt against elements of the provisional government. So the movement is in terrible disarray at the very moment that the war has been won and the French are preparing to leave. And yet, a state is constituted in those very unpromising circumstances. And I put it to you that that's actually rather strange. When you look at the difficulty the Libyans have had to get their act together to establish a state once Gaddafi had gone. 10 years, how many? No, it's 11 years later. That the Algerians, within a matter of, if you actually look at it, a matter of weeks, have constituted a state. That's really rather remarkable. And nobody remarks on it, which is why I'm remarking on it. I think sometimes, one needs to ask the question that hasn't occurred to anyone else. I think this was a very remarkable fact, and I've asked myself years ago, I've been sitting on this for a rather long time, how did this happen? How was this success achieved? By what particular combination of political forces was it achieved? And the answer is a form of politics that is yet to be identified and understood. Now, I'm using a term that may be unfamiliar to you, and if any of you are familiar with this term and have found other authors reading it, please put up your hand and tell me or approach me afterwards. Because I've been looking around for quite a long time to see whether this phrase, this term, and which is of course the name of a concept, is used by other people. And I haven't found it used by other people. I've been using it for the last 20 years in publications. And nobody seems to have noticed. Okay, well, there we are. That's, take the rough and the smooth. By formal politics, I do not mean an ideology or a doctrine. I don't mean an institution or an organization or a procedure, to use three terms that appear very early on in Samuel Huntington's classic work, Political Order in Changing Societies. I don't mean any of those things. I mean the organized application in practice of an idea or set of ideas about the state. As such, it is a complex combination of various elements, including these: a general philosophy or worldview, a particular program or set of objectives, a conception of political leadership. In other words, whoever's setting up has a view, I can lead this in this way, or it can be led in this way rather than another way. A particular set of ethics or morality, a conception of political representation, a system of procedures based on this conception, and an organization or apparatus which combines a manner of decision-making, and internal conflict resolution, a method of recruitment and socialization, a technique of mobilization, and a mode of expansion. And the form of politics I'm going to be talking about, Boussoufism, displayed all these features. The fact that it had it had all of these elements is remarkable and accounts for its tremendous success. Now, let me move to the next. Okay. My answer to the question I posed regarding the enigma is that it was Boussoufism that brought off the remarkable success in 1962. And it was Boussoufism that, in effect, having established the state, having been crucial to the constitution of the state, then functioned as the guarantor of the state of its programmatic commitments, which for its first 20 years there was remarkable continuity, and that continuity is over by 1980. Things change, a new direction is eventually taken up in 1980, not necessarily a better direction. And the direction that is taken up in 1980, away from the, if you like, ambitious development objectives of the Boumediene era, and away from the socialist element of the state's methods in the Boumediene era, the new direction, which is a more right-wing direction, is part of the reason for the terrible riots in 1988, whether people want to admit that or not. But we have governing arrangements maintain their continuity beyond the death of Boumediene into 1988. And something is functioning as the guarantor of this continuity. And it's my argument that the most important factor guaranteeing this is the form of politics I call Boussoufism. Okay, who was Boussouf and why is there an ism? Abdelhafidh Boussouf was here is the cover of a book about him. Over the last couple of decades, there's been a striking series of books published about this man by people who worked with him during the war. In extraordinary, complete contrast to total silence about Boussouf. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, nobody was publishing anything about Boussouf. And that's partly because he had what am I doing? Here we are. For reasons that will become clear, he had a very bad reputation in certain quarters. Okay, who was he? He was from a notable family from eastern Algeria, the town of Mila, northwest of Constantine, a town with quite a long history and a tradition of Arabo-Islamic learning and culture, important links to Constantine. He was a nationalist, a militant nationalist from his teens. He joined the PPA at the age of 19, and then active in both the legal front, the MTLD, from 1946, and also in the illegal, clandestine, paramilitary special organization that produced the founders of the FLN in 1954. When the OS was partially dismantled by the French, Boussouf went on the run, relocating to Western Algeria. And that was an important watershed change for him because it enabled him to put down roots, in a sense, or a political base in Western Algeria, even though he was an Easterner. He was a member of the Group of 21 who decided on the setting up of the FLN and the launching of the war. At the very beginning, he's appointed deputy commander of Zone 5, later known as Wilaya 5, that's to say Western Algeria. And in 1956, at the Soumam Congress, he is not present, but his name is there amongst the so-called candidate members of the FLN's new parliament, the CNRA. And he takes over command of Wilaya 5 at that point from Labi Ben Mahidi. Okay. He then, as commander of Wilaya 5, builds a very remarkable machine. He's in charge of the ALN, the Liberation Army, in the whole of Western Algeria, the whole of the Orani, and he takes control of the entire FLN presence, the networks, the organization of the FLN in Morocco. And you have to understand there are a lot of Algerians in Morocco, a lot of young Algerians, quite a lot of them from middle-class families, working or engaged in business in Morocco, and they are a kind of a reservoir of talent, so Boussouf sees them as potentially a reservoir of talent. He wants the FLN to get a purchase on their political reflexes. He doesn't want the French or the Moroccans to get such a purchase. He doesn't want them to be used as infiltrators. He's very concerned about possibilities of infiltration. And he gets control of the Fédération du Maroc of the FLN. So he establishes a large civilian political as well as military command. He operates from the town of Oujda in eastern Morocco. His deputy is another Easterner, Houari Boumediene, a very efficient staff officer who, at least for a while, is entirely loyal to Boussouf and works with him. Okay. At the same time, Boussouf sets up a school, the École de Cadre, a school to produce the middle-ranking cadres of the FLN and of the ALN. It has, of course, a purpose of socializing all these young Moroccan-based Algerians and anyone else who ends up in Morocco from Algeria, socializing them into the FLN as Boussouf conceives of the FLN, and training them for their roles. All right. But above all, he lays the foundations of the Algerian intelligence services. He's the father of the Algerian mukhabarat, if you like, in all their, or most of their features. It starts with a radio monitoring service and transmission services. He creates these. He gets these young Moroccans he's recruited to learn how to do the various demanding technical maneuvers and operations required. He's a taskmaster, he's stern and severe, and these young people are basically kept in confinement, working in these services. They're not allowed out, but it produces remarkably quickly, a very efficient monitoring service, listening to French military radio and things like that, learning how to break codes, and learning how to broadcast to ALN, that's to say Liberation Army units, inside Algeria. He also, through a close friend, another Easterner, Messaoud Zara, sets up the beginnings of the FLN's own armaments industry. So this is a man who is thinking about what do we need, and we need this, and we need that, and we need the other, and he does what it takes to answer that need, setting up services, setting up massively increasing and diversifying the capacities of the revolution. It really is a kind of tour de force. At the Second Congress of the FLN, he becomes a full member of the CNRA, and he becomes a member of the top leadership, the Committee of Coordination and Execution, which is enlarged from 5 to 9 at the expense of the man who previously dominated this, the Kabyle leader Aban Ramdan. So Boussouf is a rising force in the FLN very clearly by 1957. He then takes a key role in setting up the provisional government in 1958. He becomes a minister, as Minister of General Liaisons and Communications. In other words, his intelligence empire becomes the basis of his ministry. And he becomes one of the three leading members known as the three Bs, Boussouf, Bentobel, and Belkacem. This is really a bit of sleight of hand because Belkacem Krim's family name was Krim, not Belkacem. But the other two, Boussouf and Bentobel, is their family names. And these were widely perceived as the three heavyweights of the provisional government, rightly so. At the same time, with Bentobel, who is from near Mila, from Grarem, not far from Mila, they know each other, they consider themselves to be from the same neck of the woods, there's a certain solidarity between Boussouf and Bentobel, and they agree that Krim must not be allowed to become president of the GPRA. And that's linked to the fact, but it's not explained by the fact, that Krim is a Kabyle from the Berber-speaking Kabylia region. It's quite wrong to think that it's a simple sectarian ethnic prejudice. It's not that at all. There's something else behind this, but they do manage to stop Krim from becoming president of the GPRA, and they fall back on having relatively lightweight civilian figures as president. And that establishes a kind of a norm that in a way since the death of Boumedienne, has reasserted itself in Algeria. The army decides who is president, but it doesn't want a strong president. It was happy to have Chadli, who was not a strong figure. It was happy to have Bouteflika for a while, because Bouteflika was a civilian, didn't control the army. And now it has Tebboune, who doesn't control the army either. So in a way, that is a feature of Algerian politics that became consolidated. Okay, in 1960, he takes over the armaments portfolio, and his ministry is known as the Malg, and this is the term that has become sort of established in the Algerian memory. The Malg as the key ministry, Boussouf's ministry, and the people who served under Boussouf in the Malg are known as les Malgaches. This is a very Algerian play on words. Malgache is, of course, the term, the adjective referring to Madagascar in the French language. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but anyway, but the Algerians have appropriated it because it works. And so in Algeria, Malgache means something very Algerian that only the Algerians really understand, which is the way they like things. In the same year, he backs the appointment of a chief of staff, at long last, a chief of staff for the ALN as a whole, and it's his protege, Houari Boumedienne, who secures appointment as chief of staff. There is Boussouf in the middle of this picture. We see Boumedienne on the left, on the left edge. A number of other faces can be recognized. The man on Boussouf's right in the dark coat is Ali Kafi, who was a leader of the Wilaya II, the North Constantinois, a very brave guerrilla fighter, though not a major force since independence, although he was briefly officially head of state for a short period. The man on the extreme right is Kaid Ahmed, who was a colorful figure who was prominent in Algerian politics in the 60s and early 70s. Anyway, there's Boussouf with his characteristic dark glasses in the center of a group, which is where he liked to be. A group of people who worked with him, who respected him, who understood what he told them, and did what he told them to do. With the war coming to an end, we have this painful moment for Boussouf when the general staff under Boumedienne rebel against the provisional government. And that really is, in a sense, the writing of the wall for Boussouf himself. He actually falls out of the political frame at this moment. Boumedienne, his protege, is carrying all before him. In a sense, Boumedienne is attracting the support that previously was around Boussouf. And taking Boussouf's project further, but without Boussouf. So at the age of 36, his political career is over, in a sense. And he accepts this with dignity. He accepts his own effacement, while encouraging his disciples, les Malgaches, to work with Boumedienne. And they form a crucial element of Boumedienne's coalition that takes power. They form the new sécurité militaire, the military intelligence networks, services that are the ears, eyes, memory, and nervous system of the state. And this is crucial. This is where Boussoufism, in a sense, with no longer Boussouf himself personally leading it, enters into the constitution of the Algerian state. From 62 onwards, from all this onwards, Boussouf was a private citizen. The story is that he had business interests, which he developed. I never saw any flesh on that particular bone. I don't know what he did with himself. But suddenly the news came through in late 1980 that he had died of a heart attack in Paris. There was some questioning as to whether that was true as well. There's no doubt that he died. Was it a heart attack? I don't know. Mystery tends to hang around him and his story. This story leaves out an episode that one needs to know about, his role in the death of Aban Ramdan. There's another picture of Boussouf, and there he is with Houari Boumedienne. And here's Aban Ramdan, who was a remarkable revolutionary, who released from French prison early in 1955, having missed the beginning because he was in jail, and it couldn't have been more honorable reasons. He locates himself in Algiers and builds up the FLN's presence in Algiers, and he's extremely creative, extremely decisive. He's full of ideas. He's very cultivated politically, and he gives the FLN a status that it didn't have before. He is phenomenally creative. In particular, he builds civilian institutions to extend the FLN beyond the military, beyond the guerrilla forces in the countryside or the mountains. He's responsible for promoting the setting up of a nationalist trade union, a national union for Algerian businessmen, and the Fédération de France of the FLN in France, etc., etc. And he gets the other formations in Algerian Muslim politics before 1954 to rally to the FLN. So he's building the FLN. But at the same time, he's clearly looking for civilian forces to act as a counterpoint to the ALN. He himself is not a colonel commanding men with guns. He's operating in Algiers. He's on the run. He's relying on safe houses. He's operating under the nose of the French. And he sees himself as the political brain, and he relies on the support of the military, Krim in Kabylia, Krim's long-standing associate Amar Wamran in Wilaya 4 in the Algerois. But he thinks, and this is a very French idea, in fact, that it's his job as the really highly cultivated, very political civilian revolutionary to tell the military what to do. And that begins not to work for him, to put it mildly. It becomes an issue, and this is why this is his moment of great success at the Sumam Congress. He's the third from the right at the back, Aban Ramdan. Krim is the third from the left at the back. Ben Tobel is the second from the right at the back. Boussouf wasn't there at all. This is the moment where Aban, in a sense, has his moment of glory in 1956. Oh dear, what happened there? But he loses it subsequently, and that's a story in itself. And when at the second meeting of the CNRA, the decision is taken to enlarge the top body, the CCE, and make it more representative. No longer, if you like, a Jacobin revolutionary dictatorship, but a more representative body with all the top military commanders in all 5 zones or wilayat. Now their commander is automatically a member of the CCE, so that's why Boussouf becomes a member of the CCE. Aban cannot swallow this. He cannot adjust to it at all. He's been deposed, and he can't get over it. And it's in those circumstances that, having reasoned with him and having sent delegations, having suggested that he take time off, he's got some health issues he could have looked at and so on, he tells them all to go to hell, and engages in what the others regard as factional activity, and they eventually decide, I think very reluctantly, that they have to put him to death. And he is persuaded to go on a mission to Morocco, and there he is welcomed by Boussouf and Boussouf's men, who then kill him. And this is the great scandal, or is seen by many and presented by many as the great scandal in the history of the FLN, the wartime FLN. It's particularly viewed as a scandal by a lot of the French Algeria specialists. I don't regard it as a scandal, I regard it as a tragedy. And I think when you think of the number of French revolutionaries who ended up being guillotined by their fellow revolutionaries, I can't help thinking that there's a certain element of effrontery in French sneering at the Algerian FLN for killing one of their leaders, having tried to persuade him to sort of calm down and back off and have a break. It wasn't their first, it was their last resort. And Boussouf was the person who did the needful, who did the dirty work. And that's why he's had a bad reputation. It sort of followed his name ever since, naturally in Kabylia, where there is a kind of veneration of Aban Ramdan. That's understandable. But in my view, it has prevented large elements of Algerian society from understanding the real logics of what happened during the war. Okay, so I've just wanted to include that. Now, what are the components of Boussoufism? And how much time do I have left? We started at about 10, 15 past or something?
Yes.
So I've had 35 minutes?
Yes, yeah.
So I can have another 15, 20?
But yes, perfect. Leave time for some
I don't
questions.
see any of you falling asleep yet, so, okay.
No, that'd be perfect.
Okay, because there is quite a lot to get through. Boussoufism, let's have a sort of an anatomy of it, or an inventory of its elements. Political modernism, definitely. Revolutionary nationalism, definitely. But then most of the people in the FLN could say the same. Not all. Not all of them were political modernists. But most of the leaders you could say the same. This was nothing specific to Boussouf. It's part of what he had in common with his peers. But he comes from a rather aristocratic background. Okay, his branch, as I understand it, of the Boussouf family in Mila was the less well-off branch, the slightly déclassé branch. This happened to aristocratic families during the colonial period. Some invested in the colonial period and prospered, and others didn't invest and didn't prosper. But there's, in my view, definitely a kind of aristocratic tradition behind Boussouf. And he had certain aristocratic, by which I mean high-minded, attitudes and manners. I think this is a noticeable feature of him. Yet he is clearly wants a radical popular revolution. He wants the people there. So it's an aristocratic embrace of populism. Not so much an identification with it as an embrace of it for strategic political reasons. Recognizing the role of the people is indispensable to the winning of the war, and determination to maintain this union in the building of the independent state. Okay. Third point, political strategy. Again, we can subdivide this into several elements. First, the one I've in a sense already mentioned, but secure and maintain control of the ALN by equipping it and enhancing its efficacy while making Boussouf and his people indispensable to it. It's a strategy for taking control of the army by giving the army the intelligence it needs and the arms it needs. And this is a kind of alternative strategy to Aban's strategy. Aban's strategy was really to assume, I'm more intelligent than you, do as I say. I mean, it was a Jacobin-inspired, French-inspired, if you like, stance of exhorting and enjoining. Now, Boussouf doesn't do any of that. Boussouf doesn't make any such claims for himself. He provides, he makes available the intelligence his peers need in order to function. He makes available the arms they need in order to function. That gives him enormous influence, and he hasn't put any backs up in the way that Aban undoubtedly did put backs up. Le pauvre, mesquin. But he did, there's no doubt about it. People resented being lectured by him, and the person who resented it more than anyone else was Belkacem Krim. And that's a story between Kabils. That's a Kabilo-Kabil problem, and that such problems do arise. But Boussouf, in other words, can be seen as partly, if silently, agreeing with Aban that there is an issue: who controls the army? Who controls the men with guns? And Boussouf, basically, his answer is, it has to be another man with guns, but who's got more than guns. And that's Boussouf. Boussouf provides the elements of a strategy for restraining, influencing, allying with, winning over, and controlling all the other top military brass. And the intelligence function is, of course, key, absolutely key. There used to be, when there was a miners' union in South Wales, the banners of the South Wales Federation of the National Union of Miners used to have the slogan, "Knowledge is power." Well, you could say that's Boussouf's slogan, knowledge is power. The intelligence services become absolutely strategically key in the difficult equation of the army and controlling it. So we have that, and the radio monitoring, transmissions, and all this. He's successful in getting ramifications of his budding intelligence empire in every level of the ALN inside Algeria. There is, at the top level, the Conseil de Wilaya, the Wilaya Council, there will be a commandant in charge of renseignement et communication. or renseignement et liaison. In other words, intelligence and liaisons. In other words, Boussouf's counterpart, Boussouf's man at that level. And at every level in the organization of the ALN, in each wilaya, this was a tour de force in terms of spreading his influence. Okay. Second element, promoting his own wilaya to be the largest wilaya in Algeria. This is something that's gone unremarked. But Wilaya 5 becomes, in terms of territory, by far the biggest wilaya in the whole of Algeria, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Mali border. There's the construction of the counter-state, all the institution building that goes on, the creation of the provisional government, the creation within the provisional government of particular ministries, the creation... okay, so there's that. And then there's also his vision of alliances for Algeria, for the FLN, the Algerian Revolution, with the rest of the Arab world. He's not alone in that, but he has lots of fertile ideas as to how to go about it. And beyond the Arab world, Asia in particular. And Boussouf is one of the people who succeeds in developing relations with China and is one of the FLN delegation that meets Mao Zedong in Beijing. So he has a large vision. There's also a tactical repertoire. I've talked about strategy, but if we look at tactics, and I'm going to not have time to go into all this, you'll have to wait for the article to appear to give you the details. He has clear ideas on all these heads. On Islam, it's about moving with and encouraging, harnessing, in alliance with the what you could call the modernist wing of the Salafiyya movement. There's a very conservative wing to the Salafiyya movement that has become to the fore, of course, in the last 40 years under largely Saudi and Emirati patronage. But in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, the Salafiyya movement, particularly in Algeria, under the influence of Ibn Badis, and particularly some of his lieutenants, I'm thinking particularly of Sheikh al-Arabi Tabesi, there was a very strong modernist end to the spectrum of positions. And Boussouf links up with that. The internal politics of the FLN-ALN, I've given you some of that already. Krim mustn't be president of the GPRA. This was an unstated dogma. And it's to do with their concern about the future of the Algerian state, and they anticipate a problem, a Kabyle question, if you like, and they weren't wrong. There has been a Kabyle question. I've written a lot about it. They weren't wrong to anticipate a difficulty there. But the position they take up on this, I won't say more about this unless people want me to. So there's complexities in the tactics of the internal politics of the FLN. There's also an investment in the future. Boussouf and the people around him and around Boumediene are very quick on the mark on the question of the importance of oil and gas for Algeria's future, at a time when everything is still owned by French companies. But before the war is over, they're already exploring, talking to people, envisaging possibilities, linking up with key figures in the European oil industry, particularly Mattei in Italy. So they're looking ahead. They're looking way beyond just seeing the French off. Then there's the question of the manners. I'm interested in this, other people may not be. There's definitely a strict authoritarian military aspect to Boussouf. He's a colonel. He gives orders. In the army, orders are orders. That's the army. And I don't think that in that respect there's anything particularly mysterious about the emphasis, what you could call the commandism, except that in the particular context of Morocco, where there's possibilities, the possibilities of infiltration are particularly serious. If you like, he responds to this with developing a particularly tight system of surveillance of his own troops, including encouraging people to inform. So there is a sulfurous aspect to that element of his organization, with people sometimes informing on other fellow Algerians, sometimes perhaps with good cause and sometimes without good cause. It can get very unpleasant. And that's a side that other people have remarked on, other Algerians have remarked on. But there's a constant concern in promoting people to positions of responsibility and significance, to detach them from previous social roots. And this is what I refer to as Mamlukization. And it's in a way, there's an element of Boussouf's practice in handling recruits and socializing them that recalls the behavior of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire practiced something called the gathering or the harvest, the devshirne, where they would bring in young Christian boys, teenagers from the Balkans, from southern Russia, bring them to Istanbul, and make them convert to Islam, and then train them for key positions in the Ottoman system, in the army, at court, in the bureaucracy, and so on, promising them a glittering career. But they weren't given any alternative. The point is that the process was deliberately intended to do two things. First, to give the Ottoman rulers soldiers and key officials who had no alternative to the option of loyalty, because they had been severed from their social roots by conversion to Islam. Now, Boussouf can't convert anybody to Islam because they're all Muslims already. But what he can do is go to considerable lengths in, if you like, getting them to abandon or move away from their social roots as people from this region or that region, this tribe or that tribe, this village or that village. This is a constant concern. He wants them to be, if you like, conditioned so that they will be good soldiers who do as they're told. So this is what I mean by the element of Mamlukization, and he's quite thoroughgoing about it. Other leaders do similar things in a less thoroughgoing way, other elements of the FLN leadership. Boussouf is the most thoroughgoing about it. And of course, there's the question of secrecy. There's also, and this is where I think, particularly in France, people would challenge what I'm saying, I think there is an ethical aspect to his behavior. It's striking that although he does have people killed, he has rivals killed, he participates in, he actually organizes the killing of Aban Ramdan. Although there's no doubt in my mind, the other 4 colonels on the CCE were all agreed, Aban has to die. We've given up waiting for him to see reason. We've given up trying to mollify him. He's become a real casse-tête, as the French would say. And il est têtu. Il n'écoute pas, quoi. Khalas. So, this is a tragic story. And Boussouf is the one who says, well, I'll do it. The others all hesitate to get their hands dirty. And he says, send him to Morocco and I'll deal with it. And I don't think he liked doing that, but he did it. But he sought and obtained guarantees for his own future beforehand. And that's why he survived, as long as he did. But my point is that there was this ethical rule: people were not killed until they had refused an alternative. And that's true of Aban as well as the others, that Boussouf is regarded as having been responsible for their deaths. Okay. I think I had a lot of other stuff about... There's a picture of Boussouf on the left at a meeting of the GPRA in 1958. I'm giving you a little more. There he is on the second from the left, next to Krim, at a kind of grand reunion of the GPRA following the release from prison of Ben Bella, the tall man in the middle, and other key figures who'd been in French jail since 1956. This picture was taken hours before the GPRA disintegrates completely, or a few days perhaps, not long. And Boussouf is there, as you can see, second from the left. The last thing I want to say, I've left a lot out, is that Boussoufism, as I say, in a sense, paves the way for Boumedienne. Boussouf himself, with remarkable self-control, accepts his own effacement and retires to private life at the age of 36. How many revolutionaries can do that? Boumedienne develops his version, which in my view is a variant of Boussoufism. It relies on a huge input of Boussouf's disciples, people Boussouf trained, people who learnt their politics from Boussouf, veterans of the Malg, les Malgaches, Boussouf. So we see this development into Boumedienism. Boumedienism, if you like, is a development out of Boussoufism. Here's Boumediene as the commander of the Army of the Frontiers, which is being visited by the newly released Ben Bella and his colleagues Mohamed Khider and Rabah Bitat in the spring of '62. So we have this supersession of Boumedienism, and that is, in a way, it's a bit like, I think of this as a bit like Marxism and Leninism and Marxism-Leninism. We got Boussoufism and then we got Boussoufism, Boumedienism. And when Boumediene dies, we see the Bousoufists still there in Algerian political life, re-emerging with a new project, or rather, a new version of the old project of being, if you like, the secret guarantors of the Algerian state, of the consistency of its governing arrangements, of the consistency of the most important purposes, preserving Algerian sovereignty being uppermost. A key role is played by this man, Khasti Marba, who was the head of the Sécurité Militaire, who had been a Boussouf boy, as the Algerian cognoscenti used to call them, les Boussouf boys. This was very, very in joke. Very, very few people knew about this. But he was a key figure. But then the story gets complicated later, and we don't have time for the next part of it, do we? I've run out of time. I haven't wanted to go too fast. Perhaps I have gone too fast, but I could have gone faster and it would have been worse. I think you've got the idea. This is a form of politics. It's a concept I haven't heard others use. It's not a political party. It's not an institution. And it's not a clan. The clans, so-called, are factions formed out of coteries. And the point about a clan or a coterie in Algerian politics is that it's there for as long as its members are alive. The Boussoufistes are still there. Boussouf died 42 years ago. Boussoufism is not dead. Khasti Marba was assassinated in August 1993. But the Boussoufism is not dead. So it doesn't have the limitations of an Algerian coterie or clan that is only there for as long as its members are drawing breath. And that's because it's not only an outlook, it's an example, it's a kind of tradition. And it's above all, it's a congruent set of ideas that a certain critical mass of people within the upper reaches of the Algerian political governing elite have absorbed and have decided this makes sense to us. This is what we need to keep going as a way of as informing our work in keeping the Algerian state going. They're not necessarily opposed to democratic reform. They haven't tried to promote this very far, because they have to remain, I think, here I'm sort of interpreting, they have to remain within a certain distance of the military commanders. The key thing is their relationship to the men who actually control the guns. So they can't go too far from that. But nonetheless, I think that they're an interesting element. They're an element that any opposition movement that really wanted to make a real change as opposed to simply express anger, they would need to take into account this tradition, this ism, this form of politics that is there as a tradition and an outlook within the Algerian political elite. Let me end there. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. May I ask, when will your article be published?
Well, that doesn't depend on me, unfortunately. I'd like to say next Wednesday, but I have to submit it and wait for peer reviews and so on. So I'm relying on you to sort of tell me if I'm talking nonsense, or tell me that you actually are inclined to believe what I've been telling you. So, I mean, I've been using this as a way of finding out whether there are things I need to change. And over to you, I hope.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a good 20 minutes for questions. Would anybody like to ask one? Sorry.
slightly intimidated by the mic because we're very close. Thank you so much for the talk. I was just wondering, is there an element that we can identify in terms of Mamlukization, if I'm pronouncing it well, and the resistance showed by the Kabyle region that we could talk about potentially? Or is Aban Ramdan a one-off case?
Is he a one-off case? Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. You're linking the question of Mamlukization and the Kabyles.
Resistance, yes.
And Kabyle resistance, okay. Okay. Do I answer each question as it comes, or?
Are you happy to take a couple?
I think two or three together, yes.
There's a question.
But I like that question. It's a challenge. C'est un défi. I will try to rise to it.
Thank you for the talk. On my end, I would like you to compare kind of Boussoufism and the intelligence agency that he created fundamentally with more kind of Morocco's DGSN, Direction Générale de la Sûreté Nationale, that was on the surface of it also created by revolutionaries, but at the same time it's fundamentally controlled and basically a copycat of the French Secret Service. So as Boussouf created his intelligence empire in Algeria, I'm kind of wondering the ramifications and the external influences and whether it kept itself kind of isolated from all these influences that fundamentally control the source of true political power, in this case, information being the source of power. Thank you.
Okay, let me try to answer those two to begin with. There is no doubt that certain Kabyle figures who played an important role in the armed struggle, in the war, coming across Boussouf, coming across his system, as some people call it, le système Boussouf, in Morocco, recoiled from it. The most famous was a guy called Mohandaraf Bessaoud, who wrote a book, a polemic, called Happy the Martyrs Who Have Seen Nothing, Heureux les martyrs qui n'ont rien vu, which he was someone who fought in Wilaya 4 in the Algérois and then ended up in Morocco and was horrified by what he saw, the Boussouf system. And his attitude was, this isn't the FLN I identify with. And that was before the truth about the death of Aban Ramdan had become widely understood anywhere. Other figures, Kabyle figures, took a similar view. But others, it's complicated. Krim was complicit in the death of Aban Ramdan. Krim was complicit. Another colonel, Colonel Sadaq, Slimane de Hilez, who was the commander for a while of Wilaya 4, the Algérois, was a strong supporter of Aban. And at the end of the war, he made the famous remark, the time has come to hang war criminals, and he had Boussouf in mind. Okay, so there was an element of bitterness amongst some and embarrassment amongst others in Kabylia. And in my view, a third Kabyle figure whose attitude was not entirely clear was Hossein Ait Ahmed. Not entirely clear, but that could become another long story. I don't know how far that answers you, but the point here is that an element of Boussouf's system, as I said a little earlier, was that because of the concern about being infiltrated, there was the element of intense surveillance, including encouraging people to inform on each other. That was absent from the Maquis in the mountains, where, on the whole, but we mustn't forget that in Wilaya 3 in Kabylia there was this terrible purge. I don't know whether you know what I'm talking about. The French historians talk of la bleuite. They talk about a black op pulled off by the French counter-insurgency officers, planting fake evidence, getting the FLN to chase its own tail, leading to dreadful purges, particularly in Kabylia, and then extended for some time to the Algérois. And those purges were horrific. It was a nightmare situation in the heart of the Maquis, in the Jura Mountains. I've spent a lot of time investigating it. So the point is that it's not the case that everything was just nice in the Maquis by any means. One shouldn't have a too romantic a view of the Maquis. Does that help you a bit? In other respects, I'll just add one thing. The colonel of the ALN in Kabylia, who in a way was most like Boussouf, was the colonel who every Kabyle, whose memory virtually every Kabyle venerates, Colonel Amirouche. And Amirouche was a very intense character. I've interviewed Kabyles of my generation who saw Amirouche when they were small boys. Amirouche came to their village, and I got them to describe him, and they said he was a sack of bones, un sac d'os. Do you understand French, any of you? And they said he was someone who never spoke. He never spoke at all. All the other ALN chiefs there would be talking and arguing and so on. Amirouche would just listen. I found this very interesting. Someone with a very intense inner life, if you like, who didn't take part in debates at all, just took decisions after he'd listened long enough. Boussouf was a bit like that. And like Boussouf, Amirouche envisaged the future, he would see a bright young Kabyle in the ALN, and he'd think, this guy shouldn't be cannon fodder, this guy should be sent to Tunisia, he's the future. In other words, he was looking ahead too, and there were lots of bright teenagers, or guys who were 20 or whatever, who Amirouche said, I don't want you to get yourself killed here. You're going to survive. You're going to learn. You're going to go to school, go to university, and you're going to serve the Algerian state. So there are people who had part of Boussouf's outlook, even if they were subjectively rivals of his. There's a lot of tragedy in the Algerian story. Okay. The gentleman at the back, I haven't seriously investigated the Moroccan intelligence services. I'm afraid the Algerian one is a full-time job, but I've only done a part-time job on the Algerian one because there's so many other things to look at in Algeria, such as the Kabyles. They take up a lot of time, which I've enjoyed giving them. But you talked of the DGSN. That sounds to me as if it stands for Direction Générale de la Sûreté Nationale, which is the police. It's not the mukhabarat.
But it's in Morocco, it refers to also the secret service.
Is that right? Now that's very interesting. Okay, it sounds as if it is performing a kind of umbrella function that it chapeaute tous les services outside the army. Does it come under the Ministry of the Interior?
No. So
which ministry does it come under?
The Ministry of the Interior, but do we have the Ministry of Defense?
I know you have the Ministry of Defense, that doesn't surprise me, but which ministry controls the DGSN?
Ministry of Interior.
That's what I just suggested.
I did not get the question then.
Well, my point is that it's different from, you see, the main intelligence services in Algeria come under the Ministry of Defense, not the Interior. Okay? Now, you asked a very important question, which I didn't begin to answer in my presentation. What are the models for the Algerian services? Because it's not the French. The French could be the models for the Moroccan, because there's substantial continuity between the protectorate and independent Morocco. Where, after all, the French, when they realize, bon, d'accord, on sort, on part. But they with the arrière-pensée, we're going to stay. But we're going to stay as being helpful to the independent Moroccan king, the monarchy, and the elite around the monarchy. So they're part of the solution for Morocco. At least that's the strategy. Not in Algeria. The Algerians had to create their own institutions against the French in the white heat of a terrible war. And so they don't look to the French services as models. They may subsequently say, well, let's, we keep an eye on them and that we may learn the odd trick from them. But the sources of models for the Algerians was the Soviet Union, the communist world, the KGB. There were stage, that's to say, groups of trainee cadet officers of the Algerian services would be sent for 3 or 4 months or however long it was to the Soviet Union to learn aspects of tradecraft, as John le Carré calls it. I don't know if you know of John le Carré, but anyway, he wrote novels about the British intelligence services. Some would go to East Germany. So I see that connection as more important to the Algerians than as non-existent to the Moroccans. Okay, so there is a difference. Will that do for the moment?
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Got time for another couple? Yes, please.
I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much for hosting this session. It's been very fascinating. My question is, in relation to what you said earlier, you noted that there hasn't been too much literature supporting, well, literature on Boussouf himself and sort of his rise and his influence. I was just curious as to if you could think of any reasons why the literature doesn't exist to sort of highlight some of the things that you've noted.
Sure. Shall I take a second question as well? It's a good question, deserves an answer, but was there one other?
Yes, thank you very much for a great talk. I wanted to ask about the ethos of Boussoufism, taking it further beyond the 80s during the civil war in Algeria. What is the role of that kind of political idea behind governance in the civil war?
Okay. That's going to be difficult to answer, but it's a great question too. All right, let me answer your question first. The literature on Boussouf. Really, the source of views on Boussouf for a very long time were those Algerians who were willing to talk about him to French journalists. And so, an early study of the Algerian War was a 4-volume history by a French journalist. It's a journalistic history called La Guerre d'Algérie by a French journalist, Yves Courrières. And his sources he talks about Boussouf, he talks about the killing of Aban Ramdan and so on, but his sources are mainly Kabyles. And that's not I'm not blaming him. He did what he could. But there's definitely an element of bias in the framing of the narrative. And I don't think any of the people who were close to Boussouf talked to Courrières at all. And if they did, they said nothing or said very little. And the point here is that during the Boumediene era, Boumediene, of course, who had been Boussouf's right arm for a long time, and relied on on fellow Boussoufists to be an important element of his entourage all the way through. Qasdi Marba is running Sécurité Militaire right up to and including the death of Boumediene. There was undoubtedly an element of embarrassment on the Boumediene regime's part. They generalize this. They discourage the writing up of the ins and outs of the history of the war. They say that their attitude is "c'est pas le moment." We're not ready, and that's not ridiculous. To encourage everyone to start talking about the war is to encourage a lot of wounds to be reopened, and they didn't want that. They wanted people to focus on a program of national development for the future. They wanted to mobilize Algerians for a possible future. So they discouraged discussion of the war. They just wanted to say, we won. God was, alhamdulillah. It was a great, glorious struggle, and the people were the heroes, but also the mujahideen, and so. So it was all kind of bland, necessarily so. And I think that's an important part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is that the people who knew the inside story of Boussouf's system, the inside story of the radio monitoring services, the transmission services, the people who had been part of that, in other words, who could bear witness, who could testify to it, who could tell their own stories, they were all obviously inhibited from doing so until relatively recently. And the change occurs, and this is where my answer to this question links up with your question. The change occurs, as I see it, and I may need to modify this a little, refine it, with the election of Bouteflika in 1999, because elements of the Boussoufist networks undoubtedly mobilized to support Bouteflika, with whom they had worked when Bouteflika was Boumedienne's foreign minister. And Bouteflika relied on the external services, and there were several services. There was counter-espionage, counter-insurgency, there was military intelligence strictly monitoring the army, and then there was, of course, the external thing, the equivalent of MI6 or CIA, which worked closely with the diplomatic service, which Bouteflika ran as foreign minister. So you get a mobilization of the Boussoufists to support Bouteflika, and in fact to earn the right to work with him subsequently. They see it's an opportunity for them to come back into a position of real influence. And that is facilitated in part by the fact that since 1991, since early on in the nightmare of the 90s, an organization has been set up for what previously was totally unorganized or totally informal, and that is an organization called the AA Malg, which used to stand for the, it used to be the AN Malg, Association Nationale, Association des Anciens of the Ministry of Armaments and General Liaisons. In other words, it's Les Malgaches. But it then changed its name to the Association Nationale des Mujahideen. They're claiming to be Mujahideen, even though they didn't fight in the mountains. They went to work in an office for the most part. And they exist as a formal association since 1991. But they were inhibited, and the story, there's lots of little kinks in the story. They were inhibited from mobilizing to any useful effect by the fact that the first president of this organization was somebody who actually wasn't a Boussoufist. And what's striking is that Qastimarba, who is the principal, if you like, bearer of the Boussoufist tradition during the 80s and into the 90s, he's got a fight on his hands. He is trying to counter the policy of the extreme so-called eradicator wing of the army, whose attitude is the thing to do with the Islamists is to kill them. And that isn't Qastimarba's view at all. Qastimarba's view is an evolution of the view I attributed to Boussouf. The Islamism is a kind of a natural element in the Algerian spectrum. We have to ensure that we have to channel it. We have to co-opt it in some way. It's a strategy of cooptation. Récupération is the French term. And he takes the position of promoting reconciliation, promoting a negotiated political solution. And the AA Malg doesn't support him. So far as I could see at the time, and I was watching fairly closely, they don't support him, and I think that's because there was a kind of blockage from the fact that they weren't being led by one of their own. And that's because the regime that agreed to license this association saw it as a bit of a threat. So, and wanted to have it one of its own people on top. This is a frequent development in Algerian, it's a sort of a classic maneuver. But I think that the Boussoufists were not responsible for what happened. Insofar as they tried to make a difference, they tried to rein it in. And when they see an opportunity, it's rather late in the day, a lot of people have died terrible deaths in the meantime, but when they see an opportunity to hurry the process of ending it with Bouteflika, they do that. And Bouteflika is allowed by the army to bring the terrible nightmare to an end. And that's the moment when you start seeing little colloques, little conferences about Boussouf. And you see people talking, emerging from nowhere, from people we never heard of, coming forward and talking about their time in the monitoring service or their time in the transition service. And then we see books appearing along these lines. And so there's actually now quite a large literature, probably 20 or 30 books of memoirs that provide the raw material on which academics such as myself could then try to construct a more precise historiography. Okay?
Folks, I'm very sorry. I'm afraid that's 7:30 and we are out of time. Thank you very much for your questions and to Professor Roberts for answering them. If you enjoyed this, the Institute has got another event at the end of the month. I think it's either the 25th or 26th of October, looking at the Maghreb in more contemporary times, in particular information and governance in Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. We've got a roundtable. You can sign up for that through our website. But in the here and now, please join me again in thanking Professor Roberts for a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, John. It's been a great pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone.